This video demonstrates knitting a gauge swatch on a bulky machine. Use this as a reference to the gauge swatch handout distributed in class or also found on Canvas for you to be able to knit this swatch independently. It's important to understand or finalize the tension dial settings that you'll be knitting at, as this will become a recorded element within the gauge swatch. Begin by working any closed edge cast on across 30 needles, 15 left to 15 right. Knit 10 plain rows. If you're beginning without a comb, you'll need to pull needles forward to hold and knit back from hold for the first several rows until you've got enough length to hang your claw weights. After knitting the first 10 rows, or the first half of the bottom margin, form eyelets equal to the number of the tension dial on the carriage. For this particular example, my tension is set to 3, so I will form 3 eyelets. Make sure that those empty needles return to working position so that on the next pass of the carriage, the needle will pick up a loop, and then in the next pass, it will form an eyelet. Knit another 10 rows after forming the eyelets to complete the bottom margin. Using a contrast color, we'll mark the measurable area. Reserve 12 inches or so of your contrast color, then take the main color out of the yarn feeder, park it, do not break it, and add your contrast color into the feeder. Knit 2 rows to form a stripe, break the contrast color, unpark your main yarn, rethread the main yarn into the carriage, and then knit the first half of the measurable area, which will be, for this bulky gauge swatch, 15 rows. At this point, it's probably a good idea to reset your row counter to 000, since it's critical that we keep track of exactly how many rows we knit into the gauge swatch. So again, we're knitting 15 stitches on top of the contrast color stripe. And then we'll use that reserved contrast color yarn to lay in 2 stitch markers on needles 11 left and 11 right. So these stitch markers will identify the 20 stitches or the width that we'll measure to determine the stitch gauge. To mark the stitches, hang a slip knot loop in the hook of the needle and pull the slip knot through the live stitch on the needle stem. Repeat this process for the opposing side. Once you've hung both stitch markers, knit another 15 rows, or the second half of the measurable area. You might want to tug down a bit on those stitch markers after you knit that first row just to make sure everything's knit off cleanly. If you've reset the row counter after that first contrast stripe, you'll knit to row 30. Once you've knit these 30 rows, park the main yarn, pick up the contrast color yarn, knit a 2-row stripe, break the contrast yarn, and then pick the main yarn back up to knit the top margin, which will then complete the gauge swatch. The top margin consists of 20 rows, the same as the bottom margin, only this time there's no need to mark the tension through the formation of eyelets. Knit the 20 rows and then bind off using any method.